It's Sunday morning in Sydney, and the churches are empty. Well, not completely empty, but far emptier than they used to be. Only 13% of Australians attended a church service in the past month. Yet something strange is happening in this sunburnt country. Walk through any Australian suburb, and you'll find community organizations feeding the homeless, volunteers spending weekends building homes for those in need, neighbors checking on elderly strangers during heat waves, and an entire nation that consistently ranks among the world's most generous in per capita charitable giving. The Australian Bureau of Statistics revealed in their 2021 census that nearly 40% of Australians now identify as having no religion whatsoever, the highest proportion in the nation's recorded history. But here's where it gets interesting. Those same Australians are living out values that look remarkably similar to the teachings of a Jewish carpenter from Nazareth, who told people to love their neighbors, care for the sick, welcome strangers, and give to those in need. They're just doing it without the churches, without the doctrine, and without calling it Christianity. The Australian story begins with religion, ironically enough. When the first fleet arrived in 1788, carrying over 1,000 convicts and their guards, Christianity came with them like cargo. Reverend Richard Johnson held the first Christian service under a tree because there wasn't even a church building yet. He described the convicts as the most abandoned people he'd ever encountered. For decades, the colonial authorities used Christianity as a tool of control, a way to reform criminals and civilize what they saw as a savage land. Church attendance was often mandatory for convicts. Religion wasn't a choice, it was part of the punishment. But Australians have always had a complicated relationship with authority. There's a word Australians use that captures this perfectly: larrikin. It means someone who doesn't take rules too seriously, who questions authority with a grin, who'd rather break bread with a mate than bow to hierarchy. This spirit was born in the convict colonies, where many of the criminals were simply poor people who'd stolen bread to survive, Irish rebels who'd fought against British oppression, or political dissidents. They didn't trust institutions, and the church was very much an institution. Hey everyone, this is Professor Archive. And before we dive deeper into this fascinating paradox of a nation that seems to embody Christian values while abandoning Christianity itself, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Are you catching this during your morning coffee or late at night when the questions get philosophical? Drop a comment below. And if you appreciate the deep dives we do into history's most intriguing questions, a super thanks would mean the world and helps us keep bringing you these stories. Now let's get back to Australia's curious relationship with faith. By the mid-19th century, gold was discovered, and people flooded into Australia from every corner of the earth. Chinese miners, German settlers, Italian farmers, Greek merchants, they all brought their own beliefs or lack thereof. Australia became a melting pot where no single religious tradition could dominate the cultural landscape the way it did in more homogeneous societies. The Catholic Irish, still bitter about British persecution, clashed with Anglican English. Presbyterians from Scotland, Methodists, Baptists, Orthodox Christians from Eastern Europe, everyone had their own version of truth. When everyone claims to have the truth, people start suspecting that maybe no one does. Then came the World Wars. Australia lost a higher percentage of its population in World War I than almost any other nation. 60,000 young Australian men died, many at Gallipoli in Turkey, in a campaign that was ultimately a failure. They'd been sent there by British commanders, blessed by military chaplains, told that God was on their side. When those boys didn't come home, when entire small towns lost all their young men, Australians started asking harder questions about a God who would allow such senseless slaughter. The parish churches held memorial services, but the memorials themselves became secular shrines. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra, opened in 1941, is deliberately non-religious in its architecture and ceremony. It honors sacrifice without invoking divine purpose. Post-war Australia saw a brief religious revival in the 1950s, but it was shallow, more about social conformity than genuine faith. Going to church was what respectable families did, but beneath that surface, something else was brewing. Australia was developing what sociologists would later call practical atheism or apatheism, not hostile rejection of religion, but simple indifference to it. Church wasn't relevant to daily life. You didn't need a priest to tell you right from wrong. You learned that from your family, your mates, your experience. Here's where the Jesus part comes in, and it's genuinely fascinating. When you actually read the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, not the institutional church, not the theology, just the red letters, the things Jesus himself reportedly said, you find instructions that Australians have embraced culturally, even as they've abandoned Christianity religiously. Jesus said to care for the poor. Australia established one of the world's first comprehensive welfare states. The aged pension came in 1908, invalidity pensions in 1910, and maternity allowances in 1912. By 1975, Australia had Medibank, which became Medicare, universal health care that ensures no Australian goes bankrupt from medical bills. The principle is simple. Everyone deserves care regardless of their ability to pay. That's a practical application of whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me, even if most Australians couldn't quote the verse. Jesus welcomed outcasts and ate with sinners. Australia, for all its historical failings and ongoing challenges with Indigenous rights and refugee policy, has developed one of the world's most successful multicultural societies. Walk through Melbourne or Sydney and you'll find mosques next to temples, next to churches, next to community centers, with people from 200 different countries living together with remarkably little sectarian violence. The Scanlon Foundation's social cohesion surveys consistently show that despite challenges, Australia maintains high levels of social trust and acceptance of diversity. That doesn't mean Australia is perfect, far from it, but the aspiration toward inclusivity echoes Jesus' boundary-breaking fellowship. Jesus condemned religious hypocrisy and criticized those who made shows of their piety. Australians have elevated tall poppy syndrome to an art form, the tendency to cut down anyone who gets too big for their boots, who acts superior, who claims moral high ground. A wealthy televangelist would be laughed out of most Australian communities. The flashy prosperity gospel that thrives in parts of America finds little purchase in Australia, where showing off your wealth or claiming God favors you specially is considered deeply uncool. Humility, not holiness, is the Australian virtue. Jesus taught through parables about ordinary life, farming, fishing, everyday work. Australian culture elevates the battler, the ordinary working person trying to get by. There's deep respect for tradespeople, builders, farmers, nurses, people who do real work with their hands. The minimum wage in Australia is among the highest in the world, at 23 Australian dollars per hour as of 2024, because there's cultural agreement that work deserves dignity and fair compensation. That's the worker deserves his wages embedded in employment law. Now, here's the twist that makes this story particularly intriguing. Many of the organizations doing the most to help vulnerable Australians are still religiously affiliated. The Salvation Army runs homeless services across the country. St. Vincent de Paul Society, a Catholic organization, operates hundreds of programs for people in poverty. Anglicare, Uniting Care, Baptist Care, these Christian organizations provide enormous social services. But here's the thing. They serve everyone regardless of religion. They don't proselytize as a condition of help, and many of their volunteers and even staff are non-religious Australians who just want to help people. The infrastructure is religious. The motivation is often not. A 2018 study by the Australian National University found that people with no religion were actually slightly more likely to volunteer and slightly less likely to report prejudice against minority groups than religious Australians. The difference wasn't huge, but it demolished the assumption that losing religion means losing moral behavior. Another study by Edith Cowan University in 2017 found that non-religious Australians scored equally high on empathy, compassion, and moral reasoning as their religious counterparts. But before we paint too rosy a picture, we need to acknowledge the shadows. Australia has profound moral failings that neither Christianity nor secularism has solved. The treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples remains a national shame. First Nations Australians were not even counted in the census until 1967. The stolen generations, Indigenous children forcibly removed from their families and placed in white homes or institutions, often run by churches, represents trauma that echoes through communities to this day. Between 1910 and 1970, an estimated 1 in 3 Indigenous children were taken. Many of these removal policies were justified using Christian rhetoric about saving souls and civilizing savages. The apology didn't come until 2008. Even now, Indigenous Australians face lower life expectancy, higher incarceration rates, and systemic disadvantage. If Australia is following Jesus' teachings, this is where the failure is most glaring, because Jesus consistently sided with the marginalized and oppressed. Australia's refugee policy presents another moral complexity. The country operates offshore detention centers on Nauru and Manus Island, where asylum seekers who arrive by boat are held indefinitely in conditions that human rights organizations have condemned. This stands in stark tension with Jesus' teachings about welcoming strangers. Yet polls show many Australians support these harsh policies, suggesting that the cultural embrace of Jesus' values is selective and incomplete. So what's actually happening here? Are Australians following Jesus without realizing it? Or are they following universal human values that Jesus also taught but didn't invent? This is where the question gets philosophical. The values we associate with Jesus, compassion, justice, care for the vulnerable, skepticism toward wealth and power, these aren't unique to Christianity. They appear in Buddhism, in secular humanism, in various forms across human cultures. The Buddha taught compassion. Confucius taught reciprocity and social responsibility. Secular philosophers from John Stuart Mill to Peter Singer have argued for ethical systems based on reducing suffering and increasing well-being. Perhaps what we're seeing in Australia isn't a country following Jesus specifically, but a country that's internalized certain values that overlap with Jesus' teachings because those values work for social cohesion. When you have a welfare system, you have less desperate poverty. When you have less desperate poverty, you have less crime. When you have less crime, you have more trust. When you have more trust, you have a better functioning society. It's both moral and pragmatic. There's a concept in psychology called moral foundations theory, developed by Jonathan Haidt and colleagues. It suggests that humans have several innate moral foundations: care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, sanctity versus degradation, and liberty versus oppression. Different cultures and political orientations emphasize these differently. Conservative religious cultures tend to value all six, while liberal secular cultures emphasize care and fairness more strongly. Australian secular culture has heavily emphasized the care and fairness foundations. Exactly the foundations most emphasized in Jesus' teachings, particularly the Sermon on the Mount. But here's something fascinating that doesn't fit the simple narrative. Australia is becoming less religious, but it's not becoming more individualistic in the negative sense. Social trust in Australia remains relatively high. Volunteering rates are strong. Community organizations thrive. This contradicts the prediction that losing religion would lead to social atomization and moral decay. The prediction came from sociologists of religion like Peter Berger, who argued that religion provides a sacred canopy of meaning, and without it, society would fragment. Berger later revised his views, acknowledging that some secular societies maintain strong social bonds. The Australian Secular Lobby and other similar organizations argue that you can have morality, community, ritual, and meaning without supernatural beliefs. They point to Sunday Assembly, a global network of secular congregations that meet for community, singing, and reflection without religion. There's one in Melbourne. They gather, sing songs, hear talks about science or philosophy, connect with neighbors, and organize community service. Everything a church does minus the God part. Critics say this proves secularists secretly need religion structure. Supporters say it proves the structure never needed the supernatural content. What about the next generation? Australian children are now growing up with less religious instruction than any previous generation. Only 31% of Australian children under 18 are raised with any religious affiliation according to recent data. Yet schools still teach ethics, empathy, and community responsibility. Programs like social and emotional learning teach kids conflict resolution, empathy, and cooperation. These are secular versions of the Golden Rule. Treat others as you want to be treated. It's Jesus' teaching rephrased in psychological language. There's a writer named Alain de Botton who wrote a book called Religion for Atheists, where he argues that secular society should steal the best ideas from religion: the community building, the rituals marking life transitions, the art and architecture that inspire awe, the regular practice of reflection and gratitude, while leaving behind the supernatural claims. In many ways, Australia has unconsciously done this. Anzac Day, commemorated on April 25th, functions as a sacred national holiday with its own rituals. The dawn service, the minute of silence, the playing of the last post, the phrase, lest we forget. It's deeply reverent and meaningful, but entirely secular. Christmas in Australia has become almost entirely secularized. It's in summer, so people go to the beach, families gather, exchange gifts, eat too much, and enjoy time together. The religious content has faded while the communal joy remains. Santa is more prominent than Jesus in most Australian homes. Some Christians lament this secularization. Others argue the spirit of generosity and family connection still echoes the meaning even without the theology. Let me share a story that crystallizes this paradox. In 2009, a massive bushfire tore through Victoria, killing 173 people and destroying over 2,000 homes. In the aftermath, Australians from every background, religious, non-religious, every ethnicity, came together in an enormous volunteer effort. They donated money, built homes, provided counseling, opened their own homes to strangers. The response was overwhelmingly generous and compassionate. When interviewed, most volunteers didn't mention God or religion as their motivation. They said things like, "It's the right thing to do." They're fellow Aussies. Anyone would do the same. They were enacting the parable of the Good Samaritan without knowing or caring that it's a parable. They saw someone in need and helped. That's it. Dr. Miriam Pepper, an Australian sociologist who studies religion, has researched what she calls implicit religion, the ways people live out values and create meaning without traditional religious frameworks. Her research suggests Australians have strong, implicit moral frameworks centered on fairness, mateship, friendship, and loyalty, and the fair go. Everyone deserves a chance. These values function religiously in the sociological sense. They provide moral guidance, community identity, and meaning, without being religious in the theological sense. There's also an important point about what gets lost. Religious communities at their best provide intensive support networks, particularly for people going through crisis. When someone in a church community faces illness, job loss, or grief, the community mobilizes with meals, childcare, financial support, and emotional presence. Secular Australian society has some of this through family and friendship networks, but it's often less structured and reliable. The decline of religious community means some people fall through the cracks when they need help most. Religious traditions also carry depth of wisdom developed over centuries. The practice of Sabbath rest, for instance, challenges the constant productivity demanded by capitalism. Contemplative prayer and meditation offer pathways to inner peace that consumer culture doesn't provide. Fasting teaches discipline and empathy for those who go hungry, not by choice. The liturgical calendar marks time in meaningful ways beyond commercial holidays. When Australians abandon religion, they sometimes abandon these practices without replacing them, leaving a vacuum filled by work, consumption, and entertainment. So can you follow Jesus without religion? The Australian experiment suggests you can follow many of Jesus' ethical teachings, the ones about compassion, justice, humility, generosity, through secular social structures and cultural values. You can build a relatively functional, relatively compassionate society with high levels of well-being and social trust without church attendance or Christian belief. But what you can't do secularly is follow Jesus in the full sense that he intended. Jesus didn't just offer an ethical system. He claimed to reveal God's character, to reconcile humanity with the divine, to offer eternal life through relationship with Him. The Sermon on the Mount ends not with be nice to people, but with building your life on the rock of Jesus' words. The Last Supper wasn't just a farewell dinner, but the institution of a ritual remembering His sacrificial death. The resurrection claim isn't that good values continue after we die, but that Jesus Himself conquered death physically. A secularized Jesus is a diminished Jesus, a wise teacher rather than the divine savior Christians claim Him to be. Many Australians would be fine with that diminishment. They'd argue the ethics are what matter, and the supernatural claims are either unprovable or irrelevant. But from a Christian theological perspective, following Jesus without recognizing His divinity, without worship, without the transformative experience of grace and redemption, without the hope of resurrection, that's not following Jesus. That's following a moral philosophy that resembles one aspect of His teaching. What profession are you in, by the way? I'm curious whether these questions land differently depending on whether you're a teacher, a builder, a nurse, a student, or something else entirely. How do you think about morality in your daily work? Is it connected to any religious framework for you, or does it come from somewhere else? The Australian story also raises questions about sustainability. Can these secular values last across generations without the religious framework that originally taught them? Some argue that we're living off the borrowed capital of Christian civilization, benefiting from values Christianity instilled while abandoning the foundation. Eventually, the argument goes, without the foundation, the values will erode too. Others counter that values can be justified philosophically and sustained culturally without religion. Kant argued for ethics based on reason. Mill argued for maximizing happiness. Singer argues for reducing suffering. These secular ethical frameworks can, in theory, support the same values without theism. But there's also evidence that shared belief systems, whether religious or secular, strengthen social bonds in ways that pure individualism doesn't. Robert Putnam's research on social capital shows that communities with higher levels of participation in groups, whether churches, sports clubs, or civic organizations, have better outcomes on measures from health to economic prosperity. It's not the beliefs themselves, but the gathering, the shared purpose, the networks of reciprocity. Australia has maintained fairly strong social capital despite declining religion, partly because of high participation in sports clubs, community organizations, and informal social networks. The question is whether that can continue as society becomes more digital and fragmented. There's one more layer to this: Indigenous Australian spirituality. Aboriginal cultures have maintained spiritual traditions for over 65,000 years, the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. Their spirituality is deeply connected to land, to kinship, to story. It's not religion in the Western institutional sense, but it's profoundly spiritual. When we talk about Australia being secular, we're really talking about white Australia, descended from European settlers. Indigenous Australia has something else entirely: a way of seeing the sacred in country, in relationships, in the dreaming that connects past, present, and future. When Aboriginal people talk about caring for country, they're expressing values that overlap with both Jesus' teaching about stewardship and secular environmentalism, yet come from their own distinct spiritual tradition. The idea that you can separate ethics from spirituality, or spirituality from community, or community from land, these are Western distinctions that don't map onto Aboriginal thought. Perhaps the deepest wisdom isn't whether you need religion to follow Jesus, but recognizing that different cultures access truth, meaning, and moral guidance through different pathways, and none of us has the complete picture. As Australia becomes more diverse, with growing Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and Sikh populations alongside Christianity and secularism, the question shifts. It's not whether you need religion, but which approaches to meaning and morality can coexist peacefully while maintaining social cohesion. Australia's general answer has been: keep religion mostly private, make public institutions secular, and let diverse communities practice their traditions freely as long as they don't impose on others. This is working better than in many countries, though tensions exist. So where does this leave us? Australia doesn't prove you don't need religion to follow Jesus. Australia proves something more nuanced. You can build a society with certain values that overlap with Jesus' teachings through secular institutions and cultural norms, but you'll end up with something that looks like applied ethics rather than Christianity. You'll have welfare instead of charity, psychology instead of confession, meditation apps instead of contemplative prayer, secular ritual instead of liturgy. These secular versions work reasonably well for creating a humane society with decent levels of well-being. They don't work as well for addressing ultimate questions about meaning, transcendence, death, and the human hunger for connection with something greater than ourselves. The most honest answer might be that Australia isn't trying to follow Jesus at all. Australians who live compassionately, who volunteer, who support universal healthcare, who value fairness, most aren't consciously enacting Christian principles. They're being decent humans according to values they've absorbed from family, culture, education, and experience. Those values overlap with Jesus' teaching because Jesus taught universal human values, not because Australians are secretly Christian. But here's the final twist. There are Australians who are genuinely following Jesus outside of institutional religion. They read the Gospels, pray, try to live as Jesus taught, and gather in small communities or house churches. They've rejected organized religion's hierarchy, wealth, political entanglements, and hypocrisy. But they haven't rejected Jesus. They're attempting exactly what the question asks, following Jesus without religion. They're small in number, but they exist. They'd argue that institutional Christianity often obscures Jesus rather than reveals him, that the institution became the problem. They might say that secular Australia, with all its flaws, actually lives closer to Jesus' anti-establishment, pro-poor, anti-hypocrisy message than many churches do. Australian history is still being written. The rise of secularism might be temporary. Some predict a religious revival as people tire of materialism's emptiness. Others predict further decline until religion is a tiny minority practice. What seems clear is that Australia has developed a version of civil society that functions reasonably well without high levels of religious participation, drawing on values that Christianity helped establish, but that can apparently persist without it. Whether that's following Jesus is a question that depends entirely on what you think following Jesus means. If it means loving your neighbor practically through social support systems, Australia's doing okay. If it means worshiping the risen Christ and participating in the divine life, then no, Australia is not following Jesus. It's just being reasonably decent, which might be enough or might be missing the entire point depending on your perspective. Thanks for sticking with this journey through a complicated question. If this exploration made you think, challenged your assumptions, or gave you a new perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to support Professor Archive in bringing you more deep dives into history's fascinating questions, a super thanks really helps keep this going. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking truth wherever it leads.